The sound was unlike anything the French garrison had heard before. It was March of 1954, and the valley of Dien Bien Phu was shaking under the weight of incoming artillery shells. Viet Minh gunners had spent weeks dragging 105mm howitzers up jungle-covered slopes where no one believed heavy guns could go. The French airstrip, the lifeline of the entire base, took a direct hit and collapsed into a cratered ruin. The Viet Minh soldiers watching from the ridges let out a cry, "Tan Kong Chen Troi, here come the airporters." But now no planes could land. From that moment on, the garrison at Dien Bien Phu was entirely dependent on parachute drops for its survival. Ton after ton of ammunition, rice, and medical supplies drifted down under silk canopies. But the Viet Minh had a different kind of supply system, one built not on engines and fuel, but on human muscle and sheer will. Thousands of porters moved in long columns along jungle trails, carrying loads of 20 to 25 kilograms each, 20 to 30 kilometers a day. The French had air power, the Viet Minh had manpower, and they were prepared to use it until the last round was fired. The seeds of that entrapment had been sown nearly a decade earlier, in the autumn of 1945, when the first French ships arrived in Saigon harbor and the foundations of a logistical war were laid in the mud of Indochina. In October of 1945, a force called the Light Intervention Corps steamed into Saigon. It was a light mobile unit built around 2 parachute infantry companies, a few commando teams, and a special air service battalion known as the Commando Ponchaudier. The men wore British-style webbing and carried American rifles. They had been raised in North Africa and shipped to Indochina aboard British vessels. Their mission was straightforward: re-establish French control over a country that had been under Japanese occupation for 4 years. They would soon be redesignated as the 5th Colonial Infantry Regiment, and they formed the vanguard of a much larger force. That larger force was the French Far East Expeditionary Corps, commanded by General Philippe Leclerc. By December of 1945, it numbered over 46,000 men, organized into 2 colonial infantry divisions, an armored division, and supporting artillery, engineer, and signal units. It was a heavy conventional force, designed for a war in Europe against the German army. The men rode in trucks, the artillery was towed by tractors, and the supply columns stretched for miles along the few paved roads that existed. It was a force built for speed on pavement, not for mobility in the mud, the jungle, and the mountains of Southeast Asia. Almost immediately, the French High Command made a critical mistake. They broke up the division-sized formations and distributed the battalions across the country in small, isolated posts. Each garrison was responsible for the security of its own sector, guarding roads, bridges, and villages against a growing tide of resistance. This territorial static defense posture consumed enormous numbers of men in passive roles. A French battalion might find itself spread across dozens of watchtowers and fortified hamlets, each requiring a platoon or even just a squad to man it. The result was a dispersion of combat power that made it impossible to concentrate rapidly against a mobile enemy. The French reliance on motorized transport only deepened their vulnerability. Their trucks, half-tracks, and armored cars were road-bound, restricted to the limited network of highways and secondary roads that existed in Indochina. The Viet Minh, fighting with captured rifles and homemade grenades, moved on foot through the forests and rice paddies, crossing terrain where no French vehicle could follow. A French mobile group might require 100 trucks to move its supplies, and every convoy was a target. Ambushes became a daily reality, and the French found themselves fighting simply to keep their supply lines open. The Viet Minh, by contrast, had no motorized supply system to protect. Their forces were small, dispersed, and highly mobile. They could assemble a regiment in the jungle, strike a French post, and dissolve back into the countryside before the French could react. Their logistical needs were minimal: a bag of rice per man, a few rounds of ammunition, and the will to fight. The French commanders saw this as a sign of weakness. They believed that in a stand-up fight, their superior firepower and mechanization would crush the insurgents. They failed to see that the enemy was not fighting the same kind of war at all. On the night of December 19, 1946, the Viet Minh struck the French positions in Hanoi with a coordinated uprising. Explosions rocked the city, and Viet Minh fighters poured out of the side streets and alleys to attack French patrols. The French responded with heavy firepower, calling in artillery and airstrikes on the urban battlefield. For 2 months the fighting raged, and when it was over, the French held the cities, but the Viet Minh had accomplished something far more important. They had demonstrated that they could fight a conventional battle and survive, and they had bought time for their forces to withdraw into the countryside. The French consolidated their control over the urban centers, Hanoi, Haiphong, Saigon, but the countryside, particularly the northern highlands, slipped from their grasp. The Viet Minh retreated into the mountains of the Viet Bac, a region of dense jungle, limestone caves, and steep river valleys that offered natural protection against French ground and air attack. It was there that the leadership of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam established its base. Ho Chi Minh and his military commander, Vo Nguyen Giap, found shelter in the caves and forests, safe from French patrols and free to plan their next moves. The Viet Bac became the heart of the Viet Minh logistical system. Rice was collected from the surrounding valleys, hidden in underground caches, and distributed to units in the field. Small workshops produced grenades, mines, and repaired captured weapons. The General Supply Directorate, led by Tran Dai Nengia, began to organize the flow of supplies from the base areas to the front lines. Porters were recruited from the local population, and trails were cut through the jungle to connect the scattered depots. It was a primitive system, but it was perfectly adapted to the terrain, and the French could not disrupt it. Vo Nguyen Giap understood that the war would be long, and that the Viet Minh would have to build their strength gradually. He organized his forces into 3 tiers: the popular forces, the regional forces, and the regular forces. The first 2 were part-time guerrillas who defended their home villages and supported the regulars. The regular forces, the Chu Luk, were the elite. They received the best weapons, the best food, and the most rigorous training. They were organized into battalions and regiments, and they were expected to fight the main battles that would eventually decide the war. Giap knew that to win, he needed a conventional army that could meet the French in open battle. On the French side, the logistical system was far more complex, but also far more rigid. The Service de l'Intendance, led by Intendant Général Trémollet, was responsible for supplying food, clothing, and pay to the troops. The Service du Matériel handled weapons, vehicles, and ammunition, while the Direction des Essences managed petroleum products. The entire system was designed for the static defense of fixed positions, supplied over long, secure lines of communication. It was a network that required roads, railroads, and ports to function. It was not designed for a war in which the enemy controlled the countryside and attacked every convoy. In January of 1947, the Viet Minh took their most significant step yet toward building a conventional army. They formed the 308th Pioneer Division, the first division in the history of the Viet Minh armed forces. It was built around 3 infantry regiments that had fought in the Hanoi Uprising, and it represented a new level of organizational sophistication. The 308th was still a light division by Western standards, with few vehicles and heavy weapons. But it was a division, and the French had not believed the Viet Minh capable of fielding such a formation. The signal was clear: the Viet Minh were no longer just guerrillas. The French response was to fortify their positions and wait for the enemy to come to them. They built more watchtowers, laid more barbed wire, and poured concrete into the fortifications of the Red River Delta. The De Latre line, which would eventually consume 15 million tons of concrete, was the ultimate expression of this defensive mindset. But every ton of concrete was a ton of supplies that had to be shipped from France, unloaded at Haiphong, and trucked to the construction sites under constant threat of ambush. The French had the resources, but they used them to build walls around themselves. The Viet Minh had the hunger, and they used it to build an army that could go anywhere. The French High Command spent the first months of 1947 planning a decisive blow. They knew the Viet Minh leadership had retreated into the Viet Bac, the rugged highlands north of Hanoi. The intelligence reports placed Ho Chi Minh, Vo Nguyen Giap, and the entire shadow government somewhere in that maze of limestone caves and triple canopy jungle. If the French could destroy that headquarters, they reasoned, the rebellion might collapse. The plan they devised was ambitious, a coordinated airborne and ground assault deep into enemy territory. They called it Operation LEA. On the morning of October 7, 1947, more than 1,000 French paratroopers jumped into the Viet Bac. The drop zones were narrow clearings carved out of the dense forest, and the troopers landed hard on uneven ground. Simultaneously, ground columns pushed north from the delta, hoping to trap the Viet Minh leadership between the anvil of the infantry and the hammer of the airborne forces. The paratroopers seized their objectives quickly, including the village where Giap had maintained his headquarters. But the cages were empty. The Viet Minh leadership had slipped away into the hills hours before the drop, warned by their intelligence network. The ground columns fared even worse. They moved along the few dirt tracks that penetrated the Viet back, their trucks and half-tracks churning through mud and struggling against washed-out bridges. Viet Minh regional forces harassed them at every bend, sniping from the tree line and then melting back into the green. The French infantry could not move off the roads without exhausting themselves in the steep, waterlogged terrain. After 2 weeks of stumbling through the jungle, the columns linked up with the paratroopers. They had not killed a single senior Viet Minh leader, nor had they destroyed the supply caches hidden in the caves. Operation Leia failed because it underestimated the logistical resilience of the Viet Minh base area. The limestone caves of the Viet Bac were not just shelters, they were natural warehouses. Thousands of tons of rice, salt, and ammunition were stored in chambers that could not be spotted from the air. The French had thrown their best troops into the mountains, but they had not brought enough supply columns to sustain a long pursuit. Their motorized transport could not reach the hidden depots, and the weather grounded their resupply aircraft for days at a time. The Viet Minh simply waited out the storm. For Giap and the head of the General Supply Directorate, Tran Dai Nungia, the lesson was clear. The French could penetrate the Viet Bac, but they could not occupy it. The base areas were secure as long as the porters kept moving and the caves stayed hidden. The French, for their part, learned the wrong lesson. They concluded that the Viet Minh were a nuisance that could be contained by a ring of forts, not an army that required destruction. They returned to the delta and resumed building their fortress line, pouring concrete and stringing barbed wire in a great arc around Hanoi. It was a decision that handed the strategic initiative to the enemy. In October of 1949, 2 years after the failure of Operation Liais, Mao Zedong stood in Tiananmen Square and proclaimed the People's Republic of China. The Viet Minh now shared a border with a friendly communist power. Overnight, the strategic geography of the war shifted. The French had counted on the Chinese border being a sealed frontier, a natural barrier that limited the flow of arms to the Viet Minh. That barrier vanished the moment Mao raised the red flag. Giap and the head of the General Supply Directorate, Tran Dai Nungia, saw the opportunity immediately. The Viet Bac was no longer a sanctuary, it became a staging area. Chinese military aid began to flow across the border in the winter of 1949 and accelerated through 1950. The aid was not trivial. By the end of 1952, the Chinese had delivered roughly 154,000 rifles, 27,000 machine guns, and 1,500 artillery pieces to the Viet Minh. The rifles were mostly American-made weapons captured from the nationalist Chinese armies, and the artillery pieces included both Japanese 75mm mountain guns and American 105mm howitzers. The Viet Minh suddenly possessed a firepower capability that matched, and in some cases exceeded, that of a French mobile group. The Chinese also sent advisors. The head of the Chinese Military Advisory Group, Wei Guoqing, arrived in the Viet Bac in early 1950. He was not impressed by what he found. The Viet Minh command structure was still too informal, too reliant on political commissars who overruled military decisions. Qing proposed a reorganization of the general staff, replacing the loose four-bureau system with 10 specialized bureaus, each responsible for a discrete function such as operations, intelligence, training, and supply. Giap accepted the reforms. The Viet Minh army began to look increasingly like a conventional force, with proper staff procedures, standardized tables of organization, and a logistics branch that could plan months ahead. The arrival of Chinese artillery changed the tactical calculus. The Viet Minh had previously relied on mortars and captured light pieces, weapons that could harass French posts but not destroy them. The 75mm mountain guns could be disassembled, loaded onto the backs of 200 porters, and reassembled in the hills overlooking a French fort. The 105mm howitzers were heavier, but Viet Minh engineer crews found ways to drag them through the jungle using block and tackle. The French commanders in the border region believed that their posts were safe behind rivers and steep ridges. They were wrong. In the spring of 1950, Giap launched a series of probing attacks against the French forts along Route Coloniale 4. The road, known simply as RC4, ran along the Chinese border from the town of Sao Bang in the north down to the railhead at Lang Son. It was a narrow track of packed dirt and crushed stone, barely wide enough for a single truck, cut into the face of steep limestone cliffs. The French had built a string of forts along this road, including the strongpoint at Dong Quai, a blockhouse perched on a ridge that overlooked a brutal stretch of switchbacks. The garrisons were small, typically a company of Moroccan or Senegalese troops, with a handful of French officers. On September 16, 1950, the Viet Minh struck Dong Quai. The attack was not a hit-and-run raid. It was a deliberate, set-piece assault supported by heavy weapons. The Viet Minh gunners had spent weeks positioning their 75mm mountain guns on the reverse slopes of the surrounding hills. When the bombardment began, it was the most concentrated artillery fire the French had yet faced from the Viet Minh. The blockhouse walls cracked, the barbed wire was torn apart, and the defenders took cover in the cellars. The Viet Minh infantry, marching in regimental formation, climbed the ridge and swarmed the fort. By nightfall, Dong Quai was in Viet Minh hands. The loss of Dong Quai cut Route Coloniale 4 in half. The French garrison at Sao Bang, some 3,000 men, was now isolated. The French High Command faced a terrible choice. They could send a relief column up the road from Lang Son to retake Dong Quai, or they could order the Sao Bang garrison to fight its way south through the mountains. They chose the second option, a decision that would become one of the great disasters of the war. The Sao Bang column assembled on October 1st, a long serpent of trucks, armored cars, and infantry marching on foot. The road was a trap. The column advanced slowly, its vehicles restricted to the narrow ribbon of asphalt. The Viet Minh had prepared the route meticulously. They had felled trees across the road at intervals, dug firing pits into the hillsides, and zeroed their mortars on the tightest curves. The column was ambushed time and again. The drivers had no room to maneuver. The armored cars could not climb the slopes to suppress the enemy gunners. Each ambush cost men and vehicles, and the wounded had to be loaded onto the already overloaded trucks. The column had no organic air support, and the fighter bombers that did arrive could not see the camouflaged gun pits beneath the canopy. The relief column from Lang Son, a mobile group called Groupement Bayard, fought its way north, but could not break through the Viet Minh blocking positions. The two forces never linked up. The Sao Bang column was ground down over the course of 2 weeks, its men killed or captured in the steep valleys. By October 17th, the disaster was complete. The French had lost over 4,000 men, killed, wounded, or missing, along with hundreds of vehicles and artillery pieces. The survivors who stumbled into French lines were hollow-eyed, their uniforms in rags. Route Coloniale 4 was abandoned. The border was open. For the Viet Minh, the victory was transformative. They had destroyed an entire French mobile group, captured thousands of rifles and machine guns, and seized enough trucks to begin motorizing their own supply columns. The French no longer controlled a single kilometer of the Chinese border. The flow of Chinese aid, which had been a trickle of porters crossing unguarded trails, became a flood. Trucks drove directly from Chinese depots to Viet Minh warehouses in the Viet Bac. The artillery that would later shell Dien Bien Phu was already being unloaded at border crossings that the French could not reach. The war had entered its second stage. The French government reacted with shock. General Marcel Carpentier, the commander-in-chief, was replaced in December 1950 by General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny, a charismatic and aggressive officer who had led French forces in Europe during World War II. He arrived in Hanoi with a reputation for boldness and a mandate to restore French fortunes. He immediately ordered the construction of a fortified line around the Red River Delta, a massive concrete belt that would become known as the de Lattre Line. He also demanded more aircraft, more artillery, and more mobile reserves. But the strategic reality could not be hidden. The border battles had shifted the balance of power. Giap understood what the French did not yet fully grasp. The Route Coloniale 4 campaign had proven that the Viet Minh could fight and win a conventional battle against a motorized enemy. The Porter system had delivered the ammunition and rice needed to sustain a 2-week siege. The artillery crews had fired from prepared positions with a precision that surprised even their Chinese advisors. The Viet Minh had not simply survived the French counteroffensive, they had seized the strategic initiative. The next phase of the war would be fought on Giap's terms, in the hills and paddies of the Delta, and the French would be forced to react to his moves. By December of 1950, the French positions in Tonkin looked strong on paper. The Delatra line was under construction, and new American-supplied aircraft were arriving at Haiphong. The French still possessed overwhelming naval superiority and complete control of the air during good weather. But the losses along Route Coloniale 4 had gutted the mobile reserve. The battalions that had been destroyed at Dong Qui and Sao Bang were irreplaceable, given the political restrictions on sending conscripts to Indochina. The Viet Minh, by contrast, had fresh recruits from every province and a secure supply route that stretched all the way to Beijing. The arithmetic of attrition had shifted. Giap and the head of the General Supply Directorate, Tran Dai Negia, spent the winter of 1950 reorganizing their supply system for the next campaign. The lessons of the border battles were clear. The porter columns could deliver the necessary tonnage, but they needed better roads and more staging depots along the routes. Negia ordered the construction of secret supply dumps every 20 kilometers along the infiltration corridors leading into the delta. Each dump was stocked with rice, ammunition, and medical supplies, all carried on the backs of thousands of laborers. The French Air Force would try to find these dumps in the spring, but the jungle canopy was thick, and the caves were deep. The French retreat from the border also freed a vast pool of Viet Minh labor. The villages that had once supplied rice to the French garrisons now sent their young men and women to the porter corps. The number of civilian porters available to the Viet Minh Logistics Directorate doubled in the months after the Cao Bang disaster. These porters were not organized as a standing army. They were recruited for each campaign and released afterward, a logistical model that required no garrison duty, no barracks, and no permanent supply line to maintain. It was a system perfectly adapted to a subsistence economy and a rural population that owed its loyalty to the resistance. The French High Command, still reeling from the border defeat, began to understand the nature of the threat they faced. General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny, now firmly in command, wrote a series of directives emphasizing that the enemy was not a guerrilla band, but a conventional army with a functioning logistics system. He ordered his staff to study the routes between China and the Viet Bac. The intelligence reports that came back were sobering. The Viet Minh had built a road network that bypassed the French forts entirely, using mountain passes that had never been mapped. Trucks could drive from the Chinese border to the outskirts of the delta without once touching a French-controlled road. The War of Outposts was over. On November 1, 1950, the United States signed a military assistance agreement with France, providing aircraft, artillery, and vehicles for the French Union forces. The first shipments of C-47 transports and B-26 bombers arrived in Haiphong within weeks. The aid was substantial, eventually totaling over $2.5 billion by the end of the war, but it could not undo the strategic damage of the border defeats. The French now had more airplanes, but they had fewer soldiers to hold the ground. The Viet Minh had more soldiers and a logistics network that could move supplies faster than the French could bomb them. The equation had changed. As 1950 drew to a close, Giap stood in his headquarters in the Viet Bac and reviewed the maps with his staff. The next target was the Red River Delta, the rice bowl of Tonkin, and the key to French control of the north. The De Lattre line was a formidable obstacle, but it was static. Giap knew that a static defense consumes men and supplies at a fixed rate, while a mobile offense can choose where to strike. The porter columns were already moving south, carrying the ammunition for the 1st Division-sized assault on a French fortified position. The battle for the Delta was about to begin. The French intelligence officers who interrogated Viet Minh prisoners in the winter of 1950 were surprised by the answers they received. The prisoners spoke of a network of supply officers, of pre-positioned rice caches, of roads built by hand through the jungle. The French had assumed that the Viet Minh logistical system was primitive and improvised. It was neither. It was a deliberate, engineered system that had been built over 3 years of patient labor, and it was capable of supporting sustained operations against a modern army. The French had been fighting the wrong enemy. They had prepared for a guerrilla war, but they faced an army that could march, shoot, and supply itself like a European division. The year 1950 ended with the Viet Minh in control of the northern border and the French digging in around the delta. The porters were still moving, carrying their loads over the mountain trails. The Chinese trucks were still driving, their headlights dimmed, through the passes of the Viet Bac. The artillery pieces that would pulverize Dien Bien Phu in 1954 were already in the country, stored in caves that the French would never find. The war had become a contest of logistics, and the Viet Minh had just demonstrated that they could match the French ton for ton, mile for mile, on the ground that mattered most. The year 1951 opened with a gamble. Vo Nguyen Giap had spent the winter reorganizing his divisions and stockpiling supplies along the infiltration corridors that Tran Dai Nangya had carved into the Red River Delta. The target was Vinh Yên, the gateway to Hanoi. If the Viet Minh could take it, the De Latre line would be flanked before it was even finished. Giap committed the 308th Division, his most experienced formation, to a direct assault on the French defensive belt. General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny arrived in Hanoi in December of 1950, a commander who understood that his predecessor had lost the border war through passivity and dispersion. He was determined to fight a different war. Tassigny pulled mobile reserves out of the static watchtowers and concentrated them behind the incomplete fortifications. He placed artillery batteries on the high ground, overlooking the approaches to Vinh Yên, and stockpiled ammunition for his American-supplied bombers. On the 13th of January, the Viet Minh 308th Division advanced across the open approaches to Vinh Yên in battalion strength. Tassigny had anticipated the axis of attack. He massed his artillery and called in every available strike aircraft. The French B-26s and Bearcats hit the Viet Minh columns as they crossed the rice paddies, their bombs and napalm tearing gaps in the formations that the artillery then finished. The Viet Minh infantry pressed forward into the French killing zone, but they had no answer to the concentrated air power. Giap had not yet deployed his Chinese-supplied anti-aircraft guns at the division level, and the exposed approaches offered no cover. The 308th took heavy losses and stalled. Tassigny committed his mobile reserve, a regimental combat group, to counterattack the exposed Viet Minh flank. The 308th broke contact and withdrew into the hills. Vinh Yên was a tactical victory for the French. They had stopped a division-sized assault with artillery and air power, inflicting thousands of casualties. But the 308th Division was not destroyed. It retreated in good order, dragging its wounded and its mortars back into the jungle. Giap had lost the battle, but he had learned a lesson. The next assault would need better preparation, better routes of approach, and a way to neutralize the French artillery. The core of the division survived, ready for the next test. 2 months later, in March of 1951, the 308th Division reappeared at Mao Khe, a critical outpost guarding the approaches to the coal port of Hon Gai. The position was isolated, accessible only by road and river. Giap believed that if he could take Mao Khe, he could split the French defensive belt in the eastern delta and threaten Haiphong itself. The Viet Minh prepared their approach carefully, moving ammunition forward under cover of darkness. Tassigny had anticipated the threat. He stationed a naval assault division, a Dinassort, in the rivers near Mao Khe. These armored landing craft carried 75mm tank guns, mortars, and twin anti-aircraft mounts. They could move freely on the waterways and deliver heavy fire support to any point along the riverine perimeter. The French also kept a parachute battalion on standby at Hanoi, ready to drop within hours. When the Viet Minh struck on the 23rd of March, they found the garrison alert and the Dinassort in position. The armored landing craft moved up the river channels and laid down fire on the Viet Minh assembly areas. The 308th Infantry pushed into the perimeter, but the naval gunfire broke up their formations. Tassigny ordered the Dinassort to land the 6th Parachute Battalion directly behind the Viet Minh assault lines. The landing craft transported the battalion up the river channels and put them ashore, cutting off the forward companies of the 308th Division. After Mao Khe, Tassigny understood that the Viet Minh could not be stopped by the De Latre line alone. The fortifications were too long, the battalions too few. Every victory consumed precious mobile reserves that could not be replaced quickly. Giap, for his part, recognized that the delta was too well defended for a single decisive blow. He began planning a broader offensive that would stretch the French defenders across multiple axes. The next blow came in late May. Giap launched a 3-division offensive aimed at crossing the Day River, a major water barrier southwest of Hanoi. If the Viet Minh could force a crossing, they would pour into the rice-rich southern delta and split the French defensive zone. The assault was preceded by weeks of preparation. Tran Dai Nangya had stockpiled rice and ammunition at secret dumps along the river, and the porter columns moved at night under strict blackout discipline. Tassigny had stationed his mobile groups behind the Day River line, but he was outnumbered. The Viet Minh committed the 308th, 304th, and 320th Divisions to the operation, the largest concentration of force the Viet Minh had ever assembled. The French could muster only 3 mobile groups and a handful of garrison battalions. The battle on the 29th of May opened with a Viet Minh artillery preparation that targeted the French command posts and artillery positions. The assault boats crossed the river under cover of smoke and mortar fire. The Viet Minh established several bridgeheads on the French bank and began to push inland. Tassigny responded by committing his mobile groups in counterattacks, shuttling them from one threatened sector to the next. The French artillery fired continuously, and the Air Force flew sorties through the monsoon clouds to hit the Viet Minh crossing points. The fighting along the Day River lasted for 2 weeks. French mobile groups would seal one breach only to see another open a few kilometers away. The Viet Minh infantry, supplied by porters who waded across the river at night, maintained their pressure, but Tassigny's mobile reserves, though stretched thin, proved just enough to hold the line. The Viet Minh could not consolidate a single bridgehead large enough to pass heavy support weapons across. By mid-June, Giap acknowledged the failure of the Day River offensive. His divisions had taken heavy casualties, and the French line had held. But the Viet Minh had demonstrated that they could sustain a multi-division operation for weeks without a single road or railway. The porters had delivered, and the secret dumps had kept the ammunition flowing. The French had held the delta, but only by exhausting their mobile reserves. Tassigny knew that he could not absorb many more such battles. In November of 1951, Tassigny decided to seize the initiative. He authorized a deep strike into Viet Minh-held territory at Hoa Binh, a provincial capital perched on the Black River west of the delta. Hoa Binh was a critical node in the Viet Minh supply network. It controlled the route from the Viet Bac to the Annamite passes, through which supplies and reinforcements moved to the southern battlefields. Tassigny wanted to cut the Viet Minh supply line and force Giap into a battle of attrition on French terms. The seizure of Hoa Binh was executed by parachute assault on the 14th of November. The French paratroopers dropped onto the town and secured the bridges and the surrounding high ground. Ground columns moved up from the delta to reinforce them, and the artillery was brought in by air and river convoy. For the first month, the French held the initiative. They controlled the roads and the river access, and they began to interdict the Viet Minh supply movements through the passes. Giap reacted with characteristic flexibility. He did not attempt to retake Hoa Binh directly. Instead, he ordered his regional forces to cut the French ground lines of communication between Hoa Binh and the delta. The Viet Minh ambushed every convoy moving along Route 6. The French could keep the road open only by sending heavily armored convoys with engineer support to clear the ambushes each time. The supply consumption skyrocketed. Every truck that reached Hoa Binh burned fuel that had to be trucked over the same road. The siege of Hoa Binh dragged into the winter rains. The French garrison was resupplied by air when the road was cut. But the monsoon reduced flying hours, and the supply drops were never enough. The Viet Minh porters, moving along the mountain trails south of the Black River, kept the Viet Minh blocking forces supplied with rice and ammunition. Giap could sustain the interdiction indefinitely. Tassigny could not sustain the garrison indefinitely. In February of 1952, Tassigny ordered the evacuation of Hoa Binh. The French pulled their garrison out overland, fighting through ambushes the entire way. The operation had cost hundreds of casualties and thousands of tons of supplies. The Viet Minh reoccupied the town within days and re-established their supply routes through the passes. Tassigny had won every tactical engagement at Hoa Binh, but he had lost the logistical battle. The De Latre line had held the delta, but it could not project power beyond it. Tassigny fell ill in early 1952 and was replaced in April by Lieutenant General Raoul Salan. Salan inherited a force that was still tied to the De Latre line and a mobile reserve that had been exhausted by the battles of the previous year. He also inherited a Viet Minh that had used the winter of 1951 and 1952 to rebuild its divisions and stockpile fresh supplies from China. The flow of aid had not stopped after the border victories, it had increased. Salan planned a major spoiling offensive for the autumn of 1952. The target was the Viet Minh supply complex at Phu Tho, on the upper reaches of the Red River. The operation, codenamed Lorraine, was designed to destroy the Viet Minh depot network and force Giap to fight a defensive battle. Salan committed 2 paratroop battalions and several mobile groups, advancing along Route 2 from the delta into the Viet Minh base area. The French paratroopers dropped on Phu Tho on the 29th of October. They seized the town and its warehouses, capturing several hundred tons of rice and ammunition. The ground columns linked up with the airborne force and began a systematic destruction of the depot infrastructure. But the Viet Minh had already evacuated the bulk of their supplies before the attack. Tran Dai Ningya had spread the stockpiles across dozens of small caches in the hills, and the porter network had moved the critical stocks out of reach. Salan attempted to exploit the success by advancing deeper into the Viet Bac, but the logistical strain on his forces was severe. The mobile groups consumed fuel at a rate that could not be sustained over the poor roads. The Viet Minh avoided direct confrontation, fading into the forest and attacking the French supply convoys from ambush. After 2 weeks, Salan ordered the withdrawal. The French had destroyed a few hundred tons of supplies, but the Viet Minh logistical system had shrugged off the loss. Operation Lorraine ended in mid-November with the French back in their delta positions. The Viet Minh had lost some materiel, but their capacity to mount offensive operations was intact. The French had demonstrated that they could still project power into the Viet Bac, but they had also demonstrated that they could not stay there. Every deep raid consumed fuel and ammunition at a rate that required a pause of several months to replenish. Giap understood the rhythm now. Within weeks of the end of Operation Lorraine, Giap shifted the strategic focus. He launched a major offensive into the Tay country of northwest Tonkin, a region of steep ridges and narrow valleys that the French had held through a network of isolated posts manned by local auxiliaries and a few regular battalions. The objective was to seize the opium-producing highlands and open a route toward Laos. The French had considered the Tay country a backwater. Giap saw it as an open flank. The Viet Minh committed the 308th, 312th, and 316th Divisions to the Tay offensive, advancing along multiple axes through the mountain passes. The French posts were too far apart to support each other. The Viet Minh isolated each position, destroyed it with mortars and recoilless rifles, then moved on to the next. The French could not block the infiltration. The trucks that the Viet Minh had received from China carried the ammunition forward over the dirt roads, and the porters filled the gaps when the roads ended. Salan responded by committing his paratroop reserve to reinforce the key post at Ningya Lo, but the Viet Minh overwhelmed it before the reinforcements could arrive. The French attempted to establish a new defensive line at Nha San, a fortified airstrip in the Thai highlands. They airlifted a mobile group into Nha San and stockpiled supplies for a prolonged defense. The tactic worked temporarily. The Viet Minh attacked Nha San in December and were repulsed with heavy losses by the garrison's artillery and close air support. But the Thai offensive had fundamentally altered the strategic balance. The French had lost control of most of northwest Tonkin. The De Latre line was now irrelevant to the war, because the war had moved beyond the delta. Salan had to accept that the Viet Minh could choose the battlefield. The French could rush reserves by air to a threatened point, but they could not hold the territory. The Viet Minh had the initiative, and they had the logistics to sustain it over the long distances of the northwest. The year 1952 ended with the Viet Minh in control of the Tay highlands and the French digging in around Nha San and the remaining posts along the Black River. Giap had lost every major set-piece battle of the previous 2 years, but he had won the campaign. The French mobile reserve was exhausted, and the De Latre line had consumed resources that could have been used to build a more flexible defense. The Porter system, the secret dumps, and the Chinese artillery had survived every French attempt to destroy them. The logistical war was tilting decisively. The spring of 1953 brought a new commander to the French headquarters in Hanoi. Lieutenant General Henri Navarre had arrived in May, inheriting a force that was still recovering from the previous year's battering in the Tay Highlands. The French mobile reserve was exhausted. The De Latre line had become irrelevant. The war had moved beyond the delta. Navarre studied the map and saw a strategic vacuum in the northwest, a corridor open to the Mekong Valley and Laos. Navarre's immediate problem was the size of his army. He had roughly 190,000 men under his command, but 2/3 of them were tied down in static defense posts, guarding roads, bridges, and villages. He could muster only a handful of mobile groups for offensive action. To create a credible striking force, he ordered the evacuation of several isolated positions, including the fortified camp at Nha San, and consolidated his paratroop battalions into a single airborne reserve. It was a gamble, but he needed the troops. Across the front lines, in the caves and forests of the Viet Bac, the Viet Minh High Command was also planning. Vo Nguyen Giap had spent the winter months reorganizing his divisions after the costly but successful Thai campaign. The 308th, 312th, and 316th Divisions had been refitted with new weapons from China. The Porter system, tested in the Day River fighting and the Tay offensive, had proven its worth. The question was where to strike next. Giap chose Laos. On April 9, 1953, 3 Viet Minh divisions crossed into Upper Laos, sweeping through the mountain passes that the French had considered impassable for large formations. The invasion caught the French by surprise. The Laotian National Army had only 1,200 men when the war began. It had grown to over 27,000 by 1954, but it was still poorly armed and trained. The Viet Minh columns advanced rapidly, overwhelming isolated French posts along the route. The French response was desperate and improvised. Navarre committed his paratroop reserve to defend the royal capital of Luang Prabang and the strategic plain of Jars. The airborne battalions were dropped into the path of the advancing Viet Minh divisions. French transport aircraft, operating from bases in Hanoi and Haiphong, flew continuous missions to supply the isolated garrisons. But the Viet Minh had chosen the timing well. The rainy season was approaching, and the French airlift capacity was limited. Giap's invasion of Laos revealed a fundamental weakness in the French position. The French could fly troops into a threatened area, but they could not keep them supplied indefinitely by air alone. The Viet Minh, marching on foot with porters carrying their ammunition and rice, were not constrained by airstrips or weather. They could bypass French strongpoints and move through the jungle. The invasion forced Navarre to confront a hard truth. He could not defend every approach to Laos with the forces he had. In July, Navarre attempted a spoiling raid to disrupt the Viet Minh supply lines. Operation Hirondelle was a classic airborne assault. French paratroopers dropped on the Viet Minh supply depot at Lang Son, close to the Chinese border. The raiders destroyed 300 tons of ammunition, rice, and equipment before withdrawing overland to the coast. On paper, it was a success. But the Viet Minh logistical system, built on dispersal and redundancy, absorbed the loss without serious interruption. The depot at Lang Son had been a convenient target, but it was not the heart of the Viet Minh supply network. The General Supply Directorate, under the direction of Tran DienGie, had long ago learned to distribute its stocks across hundreds of hidden caches in the forests and limestone caves of the Viet Bac. Destroying one depot was like cutting a single branch from a tree. The roots remained intact. The porters kept moving, and the supplies kept flowing south toward the front. The lessons of Nassan hung over every French planning session. In the winter of 1952, a French garrison of 12 battalions had defended an entrenched camp around a remote airstrip in the Thai hills. Supplied entirely by air, the garrison had repulsed a series of Viet Minh attacks with heavy losses. The base aero-terrestre concept had worked. It proved that a determined force dug in and supported by air power could hold its ground against a numerically superior enemy. Navarre now proposed to apply the Nassan formula on a larger scale. He would establish a fortified base at Dien Bien Phu, a valley in the Thai hills near the Laotian border. The base would block the Viet Minh invasion route into Laos and serve as a staging area for offensive operations against the Viet Minh rear areas. The valley was flat, suitable for an airstrip. The surrounding hills were forested, but the French assumed they could be controlled by patrols and artillery. The plan was approved in September. The Viet Minh, however, had studied Nassan as well. Giap had learned from his defeat there. He had seen how French artillery and close air support could devastate a massed infantry assault. He had also seen that the French garrison, despite its air supply, could not expand its perimeter beyond the range of its guns. The lesson was not that the base aero-terrestre was invincible. The lesson was that such a base could be isolated and starved if the surrounding high ground was held by artillery. Throughout the summer and autumn of 1953, the Viet Minh porter network expanded at a pace that French intelligence failed to grasp. Thousands of civilian laborers widened mountain trails into roads capable of supporting heavy trucks. Teams of coolies dismantled 105mm howitzers at the Chinese border and carried the components on their backs through the passes. The pieces were reassembled in hidden workshops in the jungle. By November, the Viet Minh had moved enough artillery into the hills around Dien Bien Phu to support a sustained siege. On November 20th, 1953, French airborne forces launched Operation Castor. 6 parachute battalions dropped onto the Dien Bien Phu Valley, securing the airstrip and the surrounding villages. The operation was executed with precision. There was no significant Viet Minh opposition in the valley itself. The paratroopers dug in and began constructing defensive positions. Transport aircraft began flying in engineers, artillery pieces, bulldozers, and thousands of tons of barbed wire and sandbags. The French commanders on the ground were confident. They had a working airstrip, a steady flow of supplies from Hanoi, and a garrison of over 10,000 men. The artillery batteries were emplaced, the wire laid, the bunkers built. The valley was a fortress. The Viet Minh, they believed, would either attack the prepared positions and be slaughtered, or bypass the base and leave their supply lines exposed to French air power. Either outcome was acceptable. But Giap had no intention of repeating Nasan. He ordered his divisions to dig in on the hills surrounding the valley, beyond the range of French artillery. The 351st Heavy Division, with its 105mm howitzers and 37mm anti-aircraft guns, was already moving into position. The porters who had carried the guns across the mountains were now digging gun emplacements and ammunition bunkers into the reverse slopes of the hills. The battle for Dien Bien Phu had begun before the French had finished building their fortress. The French launched Operation Atlante in January of 1954, hoping to draw Viet Minh divisions away from the northern siege. Navarre committed 7 mobile groups to the coastal plains of central Vietnam. The offensive pushed inland from the South China Sea toward the town of Quy Non. Viet Minh regional forces melted into the hills and offered no decisive battle. The main Viet Minh divisions around Dien Bien Phu never moved. The diversion had failed before it began. The French 2nd Mobile Group advanced along Route 1 with armored support and artillery. They encountered booby traps and sniper fire, but no large enemy formations. The Viet Minh had anticipated the attack and prepared their defenses in depth. French casualties mounted from mines and ambushes rather than pitched battle. Supply convoys stretched thin along the vulnerable coastal road. Each mile gained cost more in fuel and ammunition than the operation could sustain. Navarre had committed precisely the mobile groups he would later need to break a potential siege in the north. The decision revealed a fundamental misreading of Viet Minh priorities. Giap had already fixed his gaze on Dien Bien Phu and would not be distracted. The porter network in the northwest continued to grow without interruption. Operation Atlante consumed French resources without achieving its strategic purpose. By late February, the French had occupied Quy Non, but held only empty territory. The Viet Minh had simply shifted their supply routes inland and avoided contact. French air reconnaissance showed no movement of Viet Minh divisions southward. The operation had drawn exactly 0 enemy units away from the northern front. Navarre ordered a halt and began redeploying his forces back to Tonkin. The failure had consequences beyond wasted effort. French commanders now understood that Giap would not be tricked into weakening his siege force. The initiative had passed entirely to the Viet Minh. Navarre could only wait and reinforce the garrison at Dien Bien Phu. He ordered additional battalions flown into the valley throughout February. The airstrip at Dien Bien Phu became the lifeline for over 12,000 French soldiers. The Viet Minh High Command watched the French redeployment with satisfaction. Their supply lines remained intact, and their artillery positions were nearly complete. The 351st Heavy Division had finished hauling its 105mm howitzers into the surrounding hills. Chinese advisors had helped design gun emplacements on the reverse slopes. The guns could not be seen from the valley floor. They could fire directly onto the French airstrip. The porter network had delivered thousands of shells to hidden caves near the gun positions. The stage was set for the opening act of the siege. The bombardment began on the afternoon of March 13, 1954. Viet Minh artillery opened fire from multiple positions in the hills east of the valley. The first shells landed on the French airstrip at exactly 5 in the evening. Within minutes, the runway was cratered and unusable. French counter-battery fire could not locate the Viet Minh guns. They were firing from reverse slopes, hidden from direct observation. The 105mm howitzers of the 351st Heavy Division had been sighted in with precision. Chinese-supplied ammunition was plentiful, thanks to the porter network that had stockpiled shells for months. The French responded with their own artillery, but the gunners could only fire at muzzle flashes. The Viet Minh had prepared alternate positions and shifted guns between them between shots. French shells fell on empty jungle, while the real batteries continued their work. The airstrip was hit again and again throughout the evening. By nightfall, the French command at Dien Bien Phu knew they were in serious trouble. The airstrip was the only means of bringing in heavy supplies and reinforcements. Without it, the garrison would depend entirely on parachute drops. The Viet Minh had planned this moment for months. Their anti-aircraft guns were already positioned to threaten the approach corridors. French C-47 crews would now have to fly through a curtain of automatic weapons fire to deliver supplies. The destruction of the airstrip was the turning point of the battle. French aerial resupply had been delivering an average of 200 tons per day. Parachute drops could only deliver about 100 tons per day under the best conditions. The garrison needed a minimum of 200 tons daily to sustain combat operations. Flight nurse Geneviève de Gallard, who had flown 149 medical evacuation missions in 4 years, continued her work even as the runway collapsed under shell fire. Casualties were already mounting from the artillery bombardment. Medical evacuation became impossible without the airstrip. The Viet Minh gunners shifted their fire to the French strongpoints on the valley floor. Beatrice, Gabrielle, and Anne-Marie were the first positions to come under concentrated bombardment. The French defenders had constructed bunkers with timber and earth, but the heavy shells punched through. Casualties mounted rapidly, and medical supplies began to run short. The psychological impact of continuous shelling eroded the morale of even the most hardened Foreign Legion veterans. The siege had begun in earnest. Giap had finally learned the lesson of Nha San. He would not waste his infantry in frontal assaults against prepared defenses. Instead, he would let his artillery do the work of reducing the French positions. The Porter network had made this possible by delivering thousands of shells to the gun positions. Each 105mm round weighed about 40 pounds and required a porter to carry it over the mountains. The Viet Minh had dedicated 15,000 porters to ammunition supply alone. The French had no answer to this kind of logistical commitment. By April, the situation inside Dien Bien Phu was desperate. The French garrison was running low on rations, ammunition, and medical supplies. Parachute drops continued, but many fell into Viet Minh hands or landed outside the French perimeter. The Viet Minh had tightened their ring of anti-aircraft fire, making low-level drops increasingly dangerous. French casualties had reached over 2,000, and the wounded lay in overcrowded bunkers. Navarre ordered a relief operation from Laos. Operation Condor was launched on April 13, 1954. The plan called for a ground column to march from the French garrison at Seno in Laos through the mountain passes. The column was to link up with GCMA commando units already operating behind Viet Minh lines. Together they would attack the Viet Minh supply lines and relieve pressure on the garrison. The force included 3 infantry battalions, artillery, and porter columns carrying rations. The terrain was some of the most difficult in Indochina. The column advanced slowly through the jungle-choked valleys. Viet Minh regional forces harassed them at every river crossing and mountain pass. French intelligence had underestimated the strength of the Viet Minh blocking positions. Giap had anticipated this relief attempt and deployed the 304th Division to block the approach. The French column fought through several sharp engagements, but could not break through. By the end of the first week, the advance had stalled completely. The column commander reported that he could not reach Dien Bien Phu without substantial reinforcements. Navarre had no reserves to send. The mobile groups he had created by evacuating Nha San were already committed elsewhere. The airborne reserve had been dropped into the valley at the beginning of the siege. There was simply no force left to break through the Viet Minh lines. Operation Condor was called off on April 22nd. The failure of the relief column sealed the fate of the garrison. The defenders of Dien Bien Phu were now entirely dependent on airdropped supplies that could not meet their needs. Each day the Viet Minh artillery tightened its grip on the airstrip remains and the drop zones. The French perimeter contracted as strongpoints were overrun one by one. Desperate counterattacks by the French paratroopers temporarily retook some positions, but losses mounted steadily. The Viet Minh simply replaced their casualties with fresh troops fed by the Porter network. The contrast between the two logistical systems could not have been starker. The French relief column had been halted by the same terrain and enemy action that the Viet Minh porters navigated daily. French trucks needed roads, and the roads were blocked. Viet Minh porters needed only footpaths, and those footpaths were everywhere. The porters carried their loads 20 kilometers per day through the same jungle. They moved at night to avoid French air attacks, and they kept moving. The siege continued without interruption. By the beginning of May, the French perimeter at Dien Bien Phu had shrunk to a small area around the command bunker. The Viet Minh had captured the strong points of Beatrice, Gabrielle, Anne-Marie, Huguette, and Dominique in sequence. Each position fell after days of artillery preparation and infantry assault. The French defenders fought with courage but could not replace their losses. Ammunition for the 105mm howitzers was nearly exhausted. The daily ration had been cut to half a pound of rice per man. The Viet Minh launched their final assault on the night of May 6th. Sappers tunneled under the French positions and detonated explosive charges. The infantry followed immediately, overwhelming the stunned defenders. Hand-to-hand fighting continued through the night in the trenches and bunkers. By dawn on May 7th, the Viet Minh flag flew over the French command post. The garrison commander, General Christian de Castries, who had led the defense from the outset, surrendered along with the remaining able-bodied troops. The fall of Dien Bien Phu was a catastrophic defeat for the French Union. Over 10,000 French soldiers had been killed or wounded during the 56-day siege. An additional 11,000 were taken prisoner, of whom only about 3,000 would survive captivity. The Viet Minh had lost perhaps 23,000 killed and wounded, but they had achieved their objective. The French had been decisively defeated in a conventional battle. The psychological impact on French public opinion was devastating. The Viet Minh victory was above all a logistical victory. The porter network had delivered an estimated 50,000 tons of supplies to the siege lines over 5 months. This included not only rice and ammunition, but also the heavy howitzers that had destroyed the airstrip. The French had grossly underestimated the capacity of the porter system. The Viet Minh had moved over 200,000 porters through the mountains of northwest Tonkin. No amount of French air interdiction could stop that kind of manpower. French intelligence had failed to understand the scale of the logistical effort. They had estimated that the Viet Minh could support only 20,000 troops at Dien Bien Phu. In fact, Giap had concentrated over 50,000 regulars supported by tens of thousands of porters. The French had assumed that the Viet Minh could not move heavy artillery through the jungle. They were wrong. The 105mm howitzers of the 351st Heavy Division had been disassembled, carried in pieces, and reassembled in hidden workshops. The French paid for that mistake with the loss of the entire garrison. The surrender at Dien Bien Phu marked the end of effective French military resistance in Indochina. The government in Paris immediately began negotiations for a ceasefire. The Viet Minh had proved that a manpower-intensive logistical system could defeat a technologically superior opponent. The porter had triumphed over the truck. The footpath had defeated the road. The siege of Dien Bien Phu became the defining battle of the First Indochina War. The Geneva Conference opened on April 26, 1954, while the siege of Dien Bien Phu was still in progress. The French delegation arrived with diminishing bargaining power. The Viet Minh delegation, led by Foreign Minister Pham Van Dong, pressed for full independence and territorial control. The fall of Dien Bien Phu on May 7th decisively shifted the diplomatic balance. The French government fell in June, replaced by a new administration under Prime Minister Pierre Mendès France. Mendès France promised to achieve a ceasefire within 30 days or resign. The Geneva Accords were signed on July 21, 1954. The agreement divided Vietnam temporarily at the 17th parallel. The Viet Minh would control the north, and the French-backed state of Vietnam would control the south. The division was intended to be temporary, with national elections scheduled for 1956. The French agreed to withdraw all military forces from north of the parallel. The First Indochina War was over. The accords reflected the military reality created by the Viet Minh victory. The porter network that had supplied Dien Bien Phu had demonstrated the full potential of a mobilized population in modern warfare. The French logistical system, for all its technological sophistication, had failed to adapt to the conditions of the theater. The Viet Minh had lost the battles of 1951, but had won the war. The Geneva Accords formalized that victory on the diplomatic level. The legacy of the First Indochina War extended beyond the borders of Vietnam. The United States, which had funded the French war effort, now found itself drawn into the region. The Americans would inherit the French strategic predicament in South Vietnam. They would also inherit the same logistical challenges that had defeated the French. The lesson of Dien Bien Phu was clear. Air power alone could not defeat a determined enemy with a dispersed, manpower-intensive supply system. That lesson would have to be learned again at great cost. For the Viet Minh, the victory confirmed the correctness of their military doctrine. The three-stage strategy of General Giap had been validated in the most conclusive way possible. The emphasis on political indoctrination, mass mobilization, and logistical austerity had proved superior to the French emphasis on technology and firepower. The General Supply Directorate under Tran Dinh Gia had built a logistical system that could support a modern army without modern infrastructure. It was an achievement that military analysts would study for decades. The war had cost France over 90,000 casualties and billions of dollars. The Viet Minh had suffered even greater losses, perhaps 500,000 dead, but they had achieved their goal. The French flag was lowered for the last time in Hanoi in October of 1954. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam was now a reality. General de Lattre de Tassigny did not live to see the defeat. He succumbed to cancer in Paris in early 1952. His de Lattre line a monument to a strategy already overtaken by events. Intendant General Tremollet, who built the French supply services, returned to France after the war, his complex system unable to match the Viet Minh's lean porter network. General Wei Guoqing, whose Chinese advisory group trained the Viet Minh staff and perfected the artillery tactics at Dien Bien Phu, returned to China a key architect of the victory. The porters who had carried the shells to Dien Bien Phu could go home. They had earned their country's independence. If you have family stories from the First Indochina War or any connection to the events described in this series, we invite you to share them in the comments below. Your personal accounts help preserve the human dimension of this history. Please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like to support our work in documenting the logistical foundations of military conflict. Thank you for listening.